And I actually think that although I do believe podcasts are journalists, there's a rule of journalism that doesn't work as well for podcasting. So journalists are very particular about covering news stories once. And will say, well, we can't write about this in the Boston Globe. The New York Times wrote about it last week. Or, I read about this in the Times of London. It's okay to return to subject matter. You don't want to, because not everyone listens to every episode in its entirety. People discover you at different points.
In today's episode of My Podcaster, we have Chris McNulty, a true Renaissance person whose journey through the worlds of technology, arts, and community service is nothing short of inspiring. Chris is the creator and host of 2 podcasts, Polaris and the Intrazone, where he dives deep into the realms of digital work and strategic transformation. With a background as a classical pianist and a career that has taken him from New York to Seattle, Chris has worked with industry giants like Microsoft and Dell, all while holding patents in AI technology. His unique blend of creativity and storytelling not only captivates his podcast audience, but also drives meaningful change in the community. He's here to share his inspiring journey on how he built his show from the ground up and how he continues to impact the world through his work. Trust me, you don't want to miss this conversation. Tell us your name.
Yep. So, hi, I'm Chris McNulty. I am the host of 2 podcasts. I have been the co-host of the Intrazone, which is one of the Microsoft podcasts, since 2018. And since last year, I am the host of Polaris, which is a podcast for my company, Cynosure.
Polaris.
Yes.
What's Polaris podcast?
Polaris? Yeah. So Polaris takes its name from the North Star. Cynosure, we're a consulting firm. We're about 20 people. We focus on business transformation and strategy. And we use the metaphor, we help businesses find their North Star. It's a navigational metaphor. So we extend that to all of our marketing. And Polaris is the name of the North Star, which is why my partner decided to name our podcast Polaris.
Is the podcast on YouTube?
Yeah. Yeah. So Polaris is available on YouTube, Apple, Amazon, Spotify, wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
What's the name on YouTube? Because right now I'm searching, and all I can see is Polaris.
Yeah, if you look for Cynosure, Synozur, you'll find it. Synozur, you'll find it there.
Synur. Sinu. Okay. I don't know if I'm spelling it correctly. Okay. Polaris Pathways. I'll share my screen so you can see what I'm saying.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So that's that's. I know I told you that the conversation is pretty relaxed. We just Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So see, this is what I'm searching. You correct me if I'm wrong. Is this what I'm supposed to be searching on YouTube?
Polaris is with an IS. So if you just search, I put the name.
Oh, Polaris.
Yes.
Oh, I was expecting to hear Polaris. Sorry, it's the pronunciation. Is this which one is it? This one.
There's other people who use the name. If you look for Cynosure, what I added into the chat.
Yeah. You know what? You spell the Cynosure for me. Okay, don't worry. Let me just open the chat.
If you look at the studio chat, Synozur.
Okay. Synozur.
There it is. Polaris Pathways.
This one.
The very first one. That's the podcast.
Okay. Wow, you guys are crushing it on YouTube. It seems like this channel is new.
Yeah. So we use
about the year.
Yeah, we use Cynosure's YouTube channel to pick up is one of the places we distribute the podcast. But if you go to Apple, Spotify, all the rest, you can find us there as well.
Okay. So, is it 19 podcasts or it's more than this?
I'm sorry. It is. Yeah, I think we're around 20 episodes at this point. I have a couple that I've recorded and produced. We generally try to get about 2 episodes out a month. Some months are busier than others.
Okay. And each episode is about 30 to 45 minutes long. And,
yeah, it's a little, I try to keep it. My ideal time for a podcast episode is about 30 minutes.
Okay.
I've spoken about this before, Wisdom. Like I do think if you're going to be a podcaster, it helps to listen to other podcasts and just, you have to have your own style, but there's always tips and tricks you get. And goodness, there was a podcast I was listening to about 2 months ago. Someone had mentioned it to me that it was fairly popular. I'm going to leave the name of it out. And I put it on And it begins with 3 minutes of commercials and then proceeded to today we're going to talk about rock and roll and meditation, and it's a 2-hour podcast. I don't have 2 hours to give to a podcast. So I really think 30 minutes, and some of the research that we've done, especially at Microsoft, is people will give you the first 30 minutes. They might hang on for another 10 minutes or so, but when podcast episodes are getting to be, more than an hour, you're losing a lot of your audience.
I'm going to play one episode and just see what it looks like.
So let me. Okay.
Is it audio only?
It's audio only. We do audio only.
Mm.
It's a more comfortable format for many of our guests. When I have a guest come on, it's funny. Despite the fact that we can reassure them that, hey, if you say something wrong, we can edit this. They're not always as comfortable when they're on camera as if they're just audio. The truth is, when I record, certainly for, it's a little bit different. We do production a little differently at Intrazone as well as at Polaris. For the Intrazone, that's run by Microsoft. So I worked at Microsoft for 10 years. We used to actually, before the pandemic, go into the studio. We can now record locally, but we have full production support. That's always been an audio podcast. When with Polaris, we record cameras on. And so what I will do, I use the same platforms you're using, Riverside. Riverside has some great features that will automatically pull together like quick, what they call magic clips, which we'll use in outbound promotion on LinkedIn and other places. But yeah, we generally focus on audio. I have found that a lot of our audience likes to listen in the car or at the gym or places where they're just not going to have access to watch a screen.
You know why I'm smiling? If you create a video podcast, it doesn't do anything to the audio on Spotify and Apple. It still will be audio there, and people can still listen to it on their car and where they want to listen to. So now instead of just audio only, you're giving them options. So if they want to take the audio, they can pick the audio. If they want to do the video, they can do the video. So it's not like, if I do video, they can't take the audio. Those that will still listen to audio will still go for audio, and those that want to watch will still watch. So it's a thing of preference, but just giving them options.
Right. Yeah, I'd say when we want to do something that is audio and video, we do that as a webinar. In the end, the same thing. Okay. Like it's going to be, we're going to generate the video with the audio and distribute it across YouTube and other places. And some of the videos you were looking at there, are live video recordings. Just it's a different format. I like having some diversity in how people learn, because people have different learning models. So totally hear you on that. But I've also found my guests are much more comfortable being off camera than on.
Yeah, that's right. The first person that's saying this, I have not really had that issue on my podcast, right? I see the issue I have is that sometimes when I tell people that I'm going to do audio only, they're like, no, can't you do video? And I'm like, oh, no, it's audio only because my internet is terrible. And like, no, that would be nice. I would love to, if you can turn on the video for me to see your face and have us do video. And I'm like, now I'm hearing that, okay, because I think that my guests are usually more comfortable when it's video and when we can chat and yeah.
But it also it for us, I have some rules of podcasting.
Okay.
Six rules of podcasting. I'll start with the letter P. One of them is about production. And I think there are a lot of podcasts that I either have advised or appeared on or listened to where the production's not great. And I'm very fussy about the audio mix, the use of music, getting everything exactly right, making sure the packaging is there. And so because the format that I've used historically, and both I have a co-host for the Microsoft podcast. There's some similar structures, that there's usually when I'm recording, I usually do about a 5-minute intro to set up, what the subject matter is going to be, what are some recent news stories and data points that are out there. We segue into the kind of the meat of the interview. And then in that closeout, we'll talk about, I'll remind people of upcoming events. I may share another story. I record in different places. I have actually 2 studio locations that I record in, and I frequently don't record the intro and outros sections on the same day that I record a guest.
Okay.
And so I don't love having to remember, wait, I had to change my clothes so it looks like this is one unified thing. So So how long have you been doing this podcast, Wisdom?
Wait, did you stop?
No?
I thought you were sharing six rules of podcasting, and I was expecting you to complete the six. You started with production,
Oh,
and then you just stopped abruptly. Even me, I thought something went wrong with sound.
Sure. So let me just, I can walk through I was
Okay.
I was teeing it up.
Okay.
I was giving you a softball. I was expecting you to ask the follow.
Okay. Oh. No,
so
you're the star of the show.
the six rules of podcasting that start with the letter P: production,
Yeah.
persistence, particulars, promotion, preparation, and partnerships.
Okay.
So we talked a little bit about production. Like there was a podcast I was involved with once, and I listened to the host to prepare for it. And, first and foremost, they began with like a little snippet of music, and then they never said their name or the name of the podcast. And then like another, it went for, and it sounded like it was being recorded inside of a tin can. So it sounded bad. And then when they got into bringing the guest on, it sounded like they were on a distant AM radio, and they never introduced the guest. They just said, today my guest, they mentioned the first name and we're going to talk about this. But, there are certain things that listeners get accustomed to. And when I talk about production, I'll talk a little bit more about this in preparation as well, but there are certain signals that people who listen to podcasts know that if there's a pause, you fill it with music. There are signals like, we'll be right back. And we're here again. The words like that, making sure that there is, consistent rhythm and consistency in the quality and the scenes that you set up. That's really important. So the second one is persistence. And when I talk about persistence, you need to be able to develop a unique point of view for your podcast. And, when I see podcasts, when I get asked to speak in a podcast and they say, well, the subject matter is anything, 1 week we'll talk about cooking. The next day we're going to talk about comedy. And then we're going to talk about automobiles. And then I want to talk about politics. You're not sticking to one thing. So being able to stick to one thing, and I actually think that although I do believe podcasts are journalists, there's a rule of journalism that doesn't work as well for podcasting. So journalists are very particular about covering news stories once. And we'll say, well, we can't write about this in the Boston Globe. The New York Times wrote about it last week. Or I read about this in the Times of London. It's okay to return to subject matter. You don't want to, because not everyone listens to every episode in its entirety. People discover you at different points. So it's, sticking with a subject, over the weeks, over the months, I think can be super helpful. Closely tied to that is, what I talk about is particulars, which is focus, which is, again, you want to make sure that that there is a purpose to your podcast. And not just with the subject matter, but people get into podcasting for lots of reasons. Some people just like speaking, which is great. Some people have a vision of becoming an influencer. I want to use my podcast to generate advertising and do revenue that way. It's have the podcast be its own thing. Great. Some people use a podcast to amplify other things. At Microsoft, we have 5 to 10,000 listeners a week, mostly because it's a great way in an inexpensive way for us to spend an hour with some of our customers. If we go to a conference, we do a keynote, we may spend $250,000 to $500,000 running a keynote to get it online, to get 10,000 people to listen. But for, a few dollars, we get that same amount of attention using a podcast. So whatever the purpose of your podcast is, there's no wrong answer, but you need to be clear of it. The fourth is promotion, or publicity. And so with promotion, people are not going to discover your podcast automatically. For things like Apple's New and Notable, you have about 2 months to get into there. So when you are launching a podcast, generally the recommendation that I give to people is record some episodes, don't release them yet. Figure out what your topics are going to be and be able to first launch with 4 or 5 episodes ready to go, maybe at least, one a day for the first period. And then around that, podcast publicity is very, very different from other forms of publicity. Like, I can do a social media campaign for an episode, and do some paid placement on LinkedIn and so on and so forth. That'll get me some attention, but it doesn't connect as well as kind of the more, it has to be personal. And there are some other services like Mopod, in fact, which are much better at generating listenership in my experience than, doing a paid placement on Google or Microsoft or the rest. We've done a little of that. Like at Microsoft, we've done some banner ads for the podcast. And that can get, a little bit of a bump, but it's generally person to person and someone saying, hey, I heard a great podcast, and making sure that in your first couple months, you're sort of ramping up to, a good steady audience. Polaris is less than a year old. Will typically across all platforms get about 1,000, 500 to 1,000 listeners per episode, which I'm really happy with.
Wow.
The fifth, and the fifth rule is, for me, the fifth P is about preparation. So I am a stickler. I have a format that I use for pre-interviews. If you were on my podcast, Wisdom, we'd have, I have a whole system set up with some automations. So people who come on, like, they automatically are sent like the rules and the guidelines. So I know that they've gotten them, and then they can use online scheduling to find a half-hour slot for us to talk. And in that talk, we record it over Teams. So I get automatic transcription, and we'll basically talk about, start to figure out what is it that we want to talk about on this podcast. And I will use a live whiteboard, and, I'll put up sticky notes. You'll put up sticky notes, and making sure we're throwing things and concepts down. At the end of it, I have a couple of AI tools I use to organize the visuals, but then to go through the pre-interview transcript and suggest 10 or 15 questions that should be the structure of this. So I'll do a little bit of work on that, send that back to the guest. But, there is preparation that goes into that, as well as I have standardized intros and outros. I begin every podcast, from the same way. From Cynosure, this is Polaris. I'm Chris McNulty. Or, the way that I close every podcast, it's the same every time. People have a different way that they listen to speech when it's the way you and I are speaking right now. Like, people speed up and they slow down, right? It's an ordinary conversation. If there's too much of that in the ramp up and the ramp down, people aren't sure. People are reassured by hearing, that steady pace of an introduction, like, hi, we're going to do this, then we're going to talk about that, and I know what I'm saying, and I'm confident. Podcasting has made me a better speaker in many ways. For years, I've spoken to audiences and keynotes around the world. I'm not really shy about being on stage and talking to 5,000 people. Okay. And I've never needed to have formal notes, like a couple of bullet points, and I can be pretty good about speaking off the top of my head. But podcasting is making me be a little bit more thoughtful about what it is that I say and how do I say it. And people find that sort of thing reassuring. So that level of preparation and planning isn't for everyone. But again, my philosophy is I go after quality and not quantity. I had a guest on about a month ago who was promoting a new book he had written. So of course I read the book. I think it leads to a better conversation. There's more give and take if there's preparation. Otherwise, the podcast just becomes like, we're going to start recording and tell me about yourself. Tell me what you do. Tell me what's happening next. And there's not a discussion. I don't know. And the last part of it is partnerships. So similar to how you promote things, when you put a guest on your podcast, they're going to help promote your story. When I go on a podcast, I get to talk about what we're doing here, and that person-to-person relationships that you form. Well, you learn stuff about how other people do their podcasts, and you're able to offer some tips and be in that community. And it is that partnering that also can help you find the right guests. I've been looking for. There's 2 subjects I want to cover that I've been looking for the right guest. One, I want to find someone who's a specialist in technology liability insurance, because I want to have a conversation about if you studied, all of the regulatory pressures on TikTok, I would love to, and I know there are a lot of people who have businesses that are based on TikTok. What do you do if you are relying on a technology supplier and that technology goes away? Like, how do you cover that from an insurance perspective? That's one thing I'd like to, talk about. And I'm in the process of getting someone from the world of finance on. I really want her to talk about what she's seeing right now in mid-market firms. She is a part-time CFO, chief financial officer, and I think there's a lot I really want to cover about what's it like to, manage a team when you're not a full-time employee. What's it like to, and how do you know when the company's ready to bring someone in full-time to replace you? What's happening out there with, tariffs and trade, and are people rebalancing the way corporate investment is happening? If you're not investing in hard goods, are people investing in services? I'd love to get so going on podcasts helps me also network to find the guests that I want. So So those are my rules. I'm just, what are some of the things that you find to be most helpful, Wisdom?
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed about podcasting is that every host gets to make the rules. Yeah. You could go. I don't know. You've experienced it. You're guessing on that podcast. Is you could go to a different podcast and you'll be shocked. Like, how come they're doing stuff like this? I'm like, that's strange. But that's their podcast, and people listen to them, and it's their stuff. And that itself, it's nice. It's a nice freedom to have. But it's also one of the things that it's overwhelming for a lot of persons, because they then start asking, what's the right way to do my intro? What's the right way to do my hook? What should I start? Should I spend 5 minutes doing my intro? Should I spend 2 minutes doing my intro? Because they don't know what's the right thing. But at the end of the day, it's just do what works for you and your audience. And Hey, just a quick break. If you enjoying the insights so far and want even more behind the scenes ideas, inspiration, and tools for growing your own podcast, join my email list at mypodcaststory.com/join. That is mypodcaststory.com/join. You get access to helpful resources, exclusive updates, and the kind of stuff I only share with my email subscribers. Whether you're starting out or already podcasting, there's something valuable waiting for you. Head over to mypodcaststory.com/join and subscribe. Now, back to the episode.
I completely agree, because you want to be authentic. And what would be it wouldn't work for me to do a 10-second introduction. This is Polaris. We're going to, this is Polaris. We're going to start with Wisdom today. That's not what I do. The audience doesn't understand that. And I like to prepare the audience in a certain way. That works for me. There are other folks who just, hey, you need to speak for 5 minutes before the guest comes on. Like, what am I going to talk about?
Yeah. Why did you even? What was the the inspiration that led to you moving? I know you said you worked on with Microsoft 10 years. Are you still working with them, or is it like
I left Microsoft a year ago, but I still work with my colleague Mark on the Intrazone podcast. It's kind of interesting how that one got started. So Mark came to me in 2018 and said he wanted to do a podcast and would I sponsor it.
Okay.
And, I had budget. So, a lot of times people try things and they don't work. And so I figured we would put some money into getting a digital recorder and we'd do a couple of episodes and it probably would fall by the wayside. I didn't expect that Mark was going to get more budget, get Microsoft Studios involved. There's a budget mostly on promotion and production of a couple of $1,000s a month. And so with that, it really has been consistent and persistent. There's been, over the 8 years, I think we've done about 200 episodes. I'm on more than half of them. That one, it got started as, let's see what this, as an experiment, and it really stuck. Whereas for Polaris, I was mindful of two things. First, I really appreciate diversity of channel. There's people who read, there's people who listen, there's people who watch. Okay. So making sure that when, for creating a new brand, I want to have as many touch points as possible to emphasize, if we're doing a conference keynote or we're writing a blog series or a white paper or this, multiple ways to be able to approach that subject. And so with that, part of it is, we've got a good crew of people being able to, some weeks, some months, turn the spotlight on other members of the team, like our head of AI, working to get our head of digital on. I have our head of delivery management on. Our CEO has been on 4 times. Putting a spotlight on the people. We are a people-led business. And as well as being able to find subject matters that are consistent with the kind of advisory and consulting services that we do. What is the nature of strategy? What does modern marketing look like? How should people think? How should organizations prepare financially for how they forecasting? Those are topics that we give advice to clients on, and it's consistent for us to let that carry over. And the other part, so there's 2 other reasons there. One, I like talking to people. I like getting to meet people, and it gives me a reason to learn from people that I interview. And the other thing that we found is for our partnerships. I'm fairly prominent in the Microsoft community. Michelle, a bunch of us are fairly well known. So people will come and say, hey, let's work on something together. Let's write a paper, or let's do a presentation at a conference. And I've found that that takes a lot of work. And when you're getting started with another organization, you may not be a good match. A podcast is a relatively lightweight way to say, hey, let's try something. It's a conversation. We can say it wrong. We can edit it. And let's see if this fits. Because if it fits, there's more that we can do. And sometimes it works. And sometimes you realize, I'm glad we did this because, I don't know if our 2 organizations should be on a road show for 2 weeks going to different cities, because we just have different styles. A podcast helps you discover what's going to be beneficial in those relationships in a way that it's pretty easy to get started.
One of the things I see that is peculiar to your story is the fact that, you happen to do the podcast show of a company, and not just any company, Microsoft.
Right.
And I like earlier on you talked about the perspective of how, getting to a podcast that reaches about 10,000 persons per episode. That's itself, it's important, because if you wanted to do a program where you have to talk to people, it would cost millions of a really big budget.
Right.
But with a podcast, it's different. You can test ideas and it's more like a small way to test some things and see what the people really want without spending a ton of money on it.
Right. And also, one of the, we have a small agency practice. So we advise businesses on how should you market yourselves, and how should you be thinking about modern marketing and the creatives, whether you're doing something with video or with ABM, or you're using email or a podcast. We want to make sure we're doing that at a high quality level. Like our director of design, if you look at it, the logo for our podcast is very similar to the logo for our company. It's a little bit different, but if you put them side by side, you'll see they're for the same thing. And we do a little bit of making sure that we've got good visuals that we use for promoting the podcast. We spend some time on that. We sometimes will stand up special imagery for a single episode. We were doing something focused on the Microsoft conference 2 weeks ago. So we use different visuals to promote the podcast. End of year, we did a holiday episode for the holidays here in the States. So we had little Christmas trees and used holiday music instead of our usual music, which is kind of fun. I just like it. It's, I've had apart from my professional work wisdom, I've had a fairly interesting career with, writing books and podcasts and being on stages and also doing photography and doing music. And I like being able to find my songs on iTunes, and I like being able to go to Spotify and see my name there and be like, hey, this sounds pretty good. This sounds like the New York Times. The New York Times has a staff of 60 people. I have a staff of 1 person, and I need to balance it too. Like, you're doing the right thing, whether you're using StreamYard or Riverside or Adobe. I mean, you need to be able to optimize for your time. I have a day job. I am head of marketing and technology for a pretty busy professional services organization. So, I can't take too much extra time to do a podcast. And there was one day a couple weeks ago where, just through coincidence. I recorded 3 guests in the same day, and I had stuff that I had to get out because it was time bound. I hate that. Like, I like being able to take a little bit of time and think about what I want to say, and how I want to promote it.
Yeah. And that's one of the, I love the podcast hosts. They are the one producing, doing everything, and some of the things that they wish they had someone doing all those legwork, but you have to spend money if you want someone to be doing that. And most podcasts, they're not yet making money, or probably maybe that's not the purpose of the podcast. So we can't afford to get someone to do that stuff. But it would be nice to have someone, but it's not just there.
Yeah, the very first episode of Polaris, I mentioned before, like, I've been a songwriter and a performer, and I know how to do audio mixing and recording pretty well. Okay. And so at Microsoft, we can take all of our local recordings, whether we're in studio or we're doing it at home, we ship them off, and we have an engineering team that's going to fit everything together in Adobe. And so our very first episode, I did that, and I just was like, I don't have the time to do I want to clip this out. I don't like this. I want to rearrange it, because I'm fussy about making sure I may rearrange things. I may take sections out. Obviously, there's things that may be said accidentally that people want to clip in and clip out. That's really hard if you're doing it manually. But if you're using a Riverside, a StreamYard, and so forth, as you know, it makes it much simpler. The audio filtering is great. Like, I have a Blue Yeti. One of my best friends for podcasting. But when I stop and thanks to the filtering, if I stop and I record on one of these things, or if I have to record something off of Teams, I can still get a pretty good audio quality output. And, the same thing is true. I have friends who use StreamYard, similar impact. It's just gotten so much easier.
Yeah. It's about, most of the technology, they're getting much, much better day in, day out.
Right.
And it's about using what you have, to do. Eventually, for me, it's not necessarily getting more expensive stuff. It's more about, okay, this is the level of what production quality should look like, because I feel like in production quality, there's marginal utility at a point where you start spending a ton of money, but then the difference is not so noticeable. And you're into production, and you know what I'm saying. Like, there's a level where it's terrible, it's absolutely terrible, but then you leave and then it's good, and the gap is very wide. That if you spend extra bucks and extra money, buy extra stuff and all that, the difference is not going to be so noticeable. That's there's a point where it's good enough, right? It's good enough. And once you could get to that level, and because I don't want to start buying tools and things that end up restricting me from making the podcast. I don't know if it makes sense. Right?
No, it totally does.
I have lights, and it takes me about 1 hour to set up the lights every time I want to record, and that's 1 hour I could actually use for the actual podcast recording. As much as possible, I want things to be simple, easy, and straight to the point.
100% agree with that. I'll share something that you and I both know the audience may not know. When it's time to edit a podcast on Riverside, you can just edit it with the text. So it does all the transcription, and it gives stuff to you, and it shows you can see, where's there a pause that I want to take out? Where's there a filler word? And if there's something you want to remove, you just delete it. Or if there's a block that I want to move earlier, it's cut and paste. And the fact that you can work through the text is, a convenience for folks who, don't have the time and patience to crank through Adobe or Audacity and just deal with the waveform editing, because that's...
Yeah. I mean, the technology is there. It's just a matter of people deciding if they want to do a podcast or not. And I'll go back to what I said earlier on, when I said at the end of the day, the podcast host gets to make the rules. You have a podcast, Polaris, where you publish once every 2 weeks. That's about twice a month, right? That's your show. That's you. And you say, I want to do 30 minutes length and so that's your show. Other persons, they publish every day. Some persons I've interviewed podcast hosts that publish once every month, and they've been doing it consistently for the past 17 years.
Right.
So you get to make the rules, and you have to design, because most times people are like, I want to be consistent, and they're like, I'll publish 5 times a week, and then you realize that you have a demanding day job, you have kids, you have so many other things that are important that you need to spend time on, and yet you say you are going to publish 5 times a week. And it's not like you have someone that's doing the editing and all that stuff for you. You are the one producing it. And so you have to design consistency that works for you. Consistency for you could be, once every month I release an episode of about 20 minutes long. And that's it, right? And you do it every month until maybe when you do have the resources to get someone to do the editing, production, reaching out to guests and all those things, such that you don't have to spend time. But design what works for you.
And I would hope if folks are listening to this, if you're thinking about doing it, if it sounds like fun, you should do it. If it sounds like work, don't do it. And doing 5 episodes, 5 episodes a week starts to feel like work. I'm taking a very small adjustment in our production schedule because we were traveling the last 2 weeks.
Okay.
And so I was like a little bit rushed on the way out the door just to record an intro and outro so I could start the editing process while I was traveling. I'd like the editing process to be faster, but I am also the sort of person I will, I try to listen to it all the way through before it releases, but sometimes when I'm in the car, I will notice something I don't like and I will go back and remix it. That too much background sound, or the music was too loud, or the music was too soft, or I could do a better transition. I did once have a guest. We had 2 people on the podcast, one of whom had 2 open mics. So he came through just fine, but all the rest of us had echo. And that was one I did actually have to strip it down with audio engineering to, remove the echo from the second guest. And I wound up going back and I re-recorded all my own parts, but tried to make it sound natural.
Yeah. I mean, usually those things, for me, those things are like, when such things happen, I add it to my checklist, that notes to self. Whenever I have a guest, make sure that, these things, like when you spend so much time in pre-production and production, it makes post-production easier, right? If that stuff didn't happen, you wouldn't have to spend time trying to salvage and see what you can get out of it, because you spend time in production and pre-production. If I'm seeing echo and all stuff, I'm like, I tell my guests, can you leave and change this thing? Because I know it's going to take 5 minutes, but I know that 5 minutes will save me extra 1 hour.
Yep.
Editing.
Completely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ro. Earlier on with the numbers you shared for your podcast, and I'm curious, I know you talked about promotion and all that. For your own podcast, the Polaris podcast, is there any peculiar promotion method you use for your podcast? Because the numbers you mentioned, they're big, they're huge.
We try to get interesting guests. We use LinkedIn. We'll cross-promote. Oddly enough, we get a lot of pickup across Instagram. Now, Polaris focuses in business, so logically, I don't know why it connects on Instagram, but we found Instagram to get really good connection. There's 3 things that I do that are a little bit that I think are important to do. One is I will generate at least 1 graphic out of every podcast where I will take the text of something that the guest said that's interesting and make sure I have a good graphic with their picture, their name, and what they said and what the subject is, so that I can use it in outbound on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on Facebook, and so forth. And when we do things, that also gets rolled up to our outbound web property. It will show up sometimes in our outbound newsletters. So the graphic is the first piece. I mentioned, there's a feature in Riverside that'll let me automatically generate a quick 30-second clip of the guest talking. Yeah. And that's a good teaser, I found. And the third thing is a service called Mopod, which is a relatively inexpensive way of getting, a new episode out in front of 100,000 people. So
if you don't mind sharing, how much have you spent on Mopod, and what was the result like, so that we can know what to expect?
I've spent it's somewhere between $500 and $1,000.
Okay.
On promotion.
So what was the return on the investment?
Well, it's the difference between having 100 listeners and 1,000 listeners for the most part.
Okay, so what you're telling me now is you use Mopod to kind of quickly brute force getting the first sets of listeners, and then
you want to
destabilize.
Get those first sets of listeners, and it stabilizes.
Wow.
I can tell you that there's 2 things that happen. There's slow and steady growth just in your background audience, and then when you invest in something, you can take it up to the next quantum level.
One thing, and then it's just there.
Right. one thing that I've done with Microsoft, and I will probably do later this year for Cynosure, is to record live. When I say record live, I don't mean like this. I mean live in front of an audience. Go to a conference, have 100 people, have a live audience, interview on stage. It's a really interesting experience. Like, you're a host, and I've hosted, and you don't get immediate feedback. If you say something that you think is funny, you don't know how people are going to react, or something that makes people surprised. When you're in front of 100 people interviewing, and they're all listening, you're going to get immediate reactions. Plus, you can also do things like
Q&A,
hey, we have a question.
questions.
There's a question from the audience. Like, you go to the mic, sir, what's your name? Like that sort of thing. People like listening to it because the podcast that is one person just talking for 2 hours, that's hard to listen to. So having different voices and a little bit of conversation, I think, is just better for the listener. It's better for me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that idea.
Sure
That
thing.
would be one of the things I would want to try out for my podcast as the podcast grows, and we then get some sets of listeners. Probably I would try it online and try to do live stream with people commenting on the internet, and then before go into physical in real life conversations.
Right.
Yeah. What advice would you have to do you have to give to someone just starting out their podcast, and they're just dangling?
Yeah, just be patient. There's no such thing as instant success, and people won't understand your publication schedule, but the fact that you have one and it starts to get into their feed, it can take 12 months. It can take 18 months to develop the following to where you need it to be. But, be patient and ask people to listen, ask people to rate, ask people to follow, and don't just say it on the podcast. Ask your friends, ask your family. Use your network to get to that next group. I'm always fascinated that there's people who, subscribe, and like, I'll run into them in the airport and they'll say, hey, that thing you did last week, I really liked it.
Wow.
So, that's kind of cool. I like when that happens, but as long as you're patient, you'll get there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris, for making that time. I know that, you, from taking your son, back from school, and thank you so much. I'm really glad, we're able to have this conversation, and thanks for sharing some of your behind the scenes secrets of the podcast.
Absolutely.
I'm going to start experimenting with some of them, and then I'll see where it goes for me.
Well, best of luck, and don't be a stranger. Stay in touch. I'd love to hear how it's going for you. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah. What do you do, and where can listeners learn more about you and the podcast?
Well, thanks for having me on. The best thing I can tell people is, if you want to get in touch with me, go to my personal website. That's chrismcnulty.net. From there, you can get to all of my podcasts. You can get to my professional portfolio of work. You can get to some of my creative projects, upcoming places where I'm going to be speaking. That's probably the easiest place for people to connect with me, at chrismcnulty.net, or you can find me on LinkedIn.
Once again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Wisdom.
Being on the podcast. I'll stop the recording, and it should take a couple of seconds to upload, and we should be good. That's it for today's episode of My Podcast Story. I am Wisdom Okonkwo, and I hope this conversation sparked new ideas and gave you a deeper look into the heart of podcasting. If you've loved this episode, consider supporting the show by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/wisdomhq. Every bit helps keep the stories going. And hey, don't forget to follow, rate, and share this podcast with another podcaster or creator who would find it helpful. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.